There's a BBC book by Paul Abelman featuring the exploits of Eddie Shoestring called Shoestring's Finest Hour. It's available at booksellers in hardback for £5.95 or paperback at £1. And the theme music of the series is also available at record shops on a BBC single. In 10 minutes, Everyman looks at the recently published alternative to the Church of England Book of Common Prayer, which in some quarters has had a hostile reception. First, on BBC1, it's time for the news with Angela Rippon at almost 17 minutes past 10.
The Gulf War intensifies, with Iraqi forces attacking a town well inside Iran, and both sides acknowledging heavy casualties. Some of the bitterest fighting of the war so far has led to Iraqi reports of over 500 Iranians killed and accusations by Tehran radio that the Iraqis are indulging in chemical warfare and mass slaughter. The build-up of fighting followed attacks by Iraqi troops on the town of Suzangar, 20 miles inside the oil-rich Khuzestan province, and now the scene of bloody house-to-house battles. At Abadan, meanwhile, 80 miles to the south, repeated Iraqi assaults have failed to subdue the battered oil refining centre, Iran's last stronghold of the disputed Shatt al-Arab waterway. Constant Iraqi artillery bombardment across the desert waste has taken a heavy toll of Abadan's valuable oil installations and caused mounting military and civilian casualties. But Iran's Air Force, a powerful legacy of the Shah's rule, strikes back regularly against the deeply entrenched Iraqi positions. This weekend alone, the Iranians claim they've destroyed 13 Iraqi tanks on this front. But 3 raiding aircraft were shot down today, according to Baghdad radio. As the fighting raged on at Abadan, Iraq's president, Saddam Hussein, met Cuban's foreign minister in Baghdad to discuss attempts to end this increasingly savage 8-week-old war. The Kuwait government says that several Iranian jets today attacked an area of Kuwait bordering Iraq with rockets, but were driven off by ground fire. It's the second such attack during the war, and the Kuwaitis are to make a formal protest to Iran. In Bangkok, the capital of Thailand, 38 people are known to have died and nearly 400 injured when an arms factory was wrecked by explosions. Homes and commercial buildings were also damaged. The Prime Minister has ordered an immediate inquiry. From Bangkok, Steve Patton.
It looked like the aftermath of a war. Buildings were demolished, destruction was everywhere as rescue workers fought to sift through the rubble. The blast, which occurred Sunday morning at a Thai Army ordnance depot on the outskirts of Bangkok, could be heard throughout the area as billows of smoke shot to the sky. The numbers of dead and wounded are likely to go up as salvage operations continue. Thai officials said they did not know the cause of the explosion, adding that investigations were currently underway. Ambulances carrying the dead and wounded ferried back and forth between the blast site and nearby hospitals. Some of those less seriously wounded could be seen walking about, apparently days from the explosion, hours after it rocked the Thai capital. Steve Patton for the BBC, Bangkok.
In Zimbabwe, Mr. Joshua Nkomo, the Home Affairs Minister, has hinted that he might leave the coalition government unless the Prime Minister, Mr. Mugabe, does something to reduce the friction between their two parties. Mr. Nkomo accused Mr. Mugabe of destroying the possibility of forming a Zimbabwe nation, but he said he'd stay in the government until it became impossible to carry on. Meanwhile, white farmers and their families in Zimbabwe have been reassured by Mr. Mugabe that his government has no plans to seize their land. Mr. Mugabe also told them that he's considering disarming all former guerrillas. Such action could, he said, lead to a great deal of bloodshed, but he was determined to prevent a repetition of the gun battles which cost the lives of at least 55 people near Bulawayo last weekend. The Pope, continuing his West German visit, has called for greater efforts towards Christian unity and for improved human rights and religious freedom. He celebrated open-air Mass at Osnabrück in the Protestant north, and later at Mainz, again drawing massive crowds, as Graham Leach reports.
The Pope was welcomed in Osnabrück by an estimated 140,000 people. Like yesterday, the weather was atrocious, and the Pope told the crowd, who stood for hours in the pouring rain, "I hope you're not soaked to the skin." Among the audience were many Catholics who'd fled Soviet-occupied Europe after the war. The Pope thanked those Protestant churchmen who'd sheltered them. He also urged deeper contact between the two churches, which each represent about half the German population. The issue of Christian unity is emerging as the main theme of this visit, and the Pope is clearly responding to appeals from German Christians for more understanding between Protestants and Catholics. Later, the Pope flew south to the city of Mainz, where 200,000 people braved the elements to welcome him. He had a special word about unemployment, saying those made jobless after giving the best years of their lives to their work should not suffer alone. Help them to find useful work, he said.
Another visitor to Germany is the Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, who's arrived in Bonn for 2 days of talks with Chancellor Schmidt. Their talks began over dinner tonight and are expected to concentrate on the common market, East-West tensions, and the likely impact of Ronald Reagan's election as American president. A backbench Labour MP, Andrew Bennett, member for Stockport North, has said he thought up the demonstration that led to boisterous jostling when Black Rod was kept out of the Commons last week. Mr. Bennett said he didn't consult the front bench and he'd done nothing unconstitutional. The Labour leader, Mr. Foote, said today there'd be no disciplinary action, but that didn't mean he wanted this sort of thing to happen. The leader of the opposition in the Irish Republic, Dr. Garett Fitzgerald, has urged the British government not to give in to demands for political status by Republican prisoners on hunger strike in Northern Ireland's Maze prison. To do so, he said, would be to confer on them a political role which gives a sense of justification to go ahead and murder people. 3 people were taken to hospital, a father, his son and a neighbour, after an explosion demolished a house in Hebden Bridge, West Yorkshire, and damaged 2 others in the same terrace. Mike Smart reports.
Number 2 Hepton Edge was wrecked by the blast, described by a neighbour as a blinding flash followed by a deafening explosion. Debris was flung several hundred yards, and rescuers said it was a miracle anyone survived. A 60-year-old man and his son were pulled from the rubble and both were detained in hospital. Next door, Mr. Stephen Jones and his wife woke to find their home in imminent danger of collapse, and their first concern was for their daughter Rosemary.
There was just a very loud explosion, and I just told my wife, to get out of the house with the baby, and then I dashed into Rosemary's room so I could get her out. She was completely covered in rubble. There was a piece of boarding fell down from the roof and that covered her from all the bricks, but she was completely covered. She was underneath the stone, I say, for 4 or 5 minutes.
So she was saved by this piece of board, really?
Yeah.
It'll be some time before the exact cause of this morning's explosion is known, but officials are already investigating reports that residents in Hepton Edge have smelt gas in the air on a number of occasions over the last 3 days.
The film actress Imogen Hassall has been found dead at her home in Wimbledon. She was 38. Miss Hassall appeared in many films, among them The Virgin and the Gypsy and When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. The police took away a bottle of tablets from her home, and tomorrow there'll be a post-mortem. In the Lombard RAC rally, which started from Bath today, Swedish drivers are holding the first 4 places. Over the next 4 days, the 150 drivers hope to cover 1,800 miles in England, Scotland and Wales, finishing again at Bath. Andrew Harvey was at the start.
The first car to leave Bath was the Ford Escort of Hannu Mikkola from Finland, who's won this event for the last 2 years. Ahead of the drivers are 70 special stages, with the first of them at the Longleat Safari Park in Wiltshire. Most of the 200 wild animals that normally roam the park were safely locked away for the day, but there was an early scare when 2 lions escaped and had to be rounded up and tranquilized before the cars came through. Rain and mud on the road made conditions very tricky. Once again, most of the top-seeded drivers are from Scandinavia. But one of the main British hopes, Tony Pond in a TR7, had to drive for most of the stage peering through a shattered windscreen after he'd hit a boundary fence. This year's rally is longer than ever before, and it could see one of the closest finishes for years.
Nothing close about our finish because we reached it. That's the news. Let's take a look at the weather.
Although it may be dry at first in the extreme northeast of England, most places will have a dull and wet start to tomorrow. During the morning, however, somewhat brighter weather, although still with a fair amount of showers, will reach western parts, and this will quickly spread east to most other areas by the early afternoon. It will be very mild, but windy. Central and northern Scotland will stay cloudy with rain at times for much of tomorrow, and it will be colder than elsewhere, so that snow is likely over the hills. And that's the weather forecast.
And now, news of Panorama.
In tomorrow night's programme, Robin Day talks to Sir Harold Wilson about the future of the Labour Party and of Mrs Thatcher.
It's quite clear to me the Tory party will get rid of her in about 3 years' time, and she'll then be in Tory mythology.
Before the next election?
Oh, very likely. If they decide they're going to lose the next election with her there, she'll be ditched, and it will be as though she's never been. She'll become a non-person. They're a very, very cruel party.
And we report on a crusade by the editor of The Times.
I'm going to get the sack in 3 weeks' time or 4 weeks' time. And actually it's a great help. It's help because it's so completely liberating. I'm now in a position where the one responsibility I have is to try and save the Times.
In Canada, Lord Thompson hears the editor's plans.
His certainly has merit and will be considered fairly seriously.
Halloween in Washington and lunch with editor Ben Bradley. Any message for The Times and its readers and its staff?
Oh gosh, just get on with it. I mean, a newspaper that isn't publishing it's like a graveyard. It's an offense against nature.
That's The Times Crusade and Sir Harold Wilson. Panorama tomorrow at 8:10.
Just starting on BBC2, the Great American Picture Show with a thriller starring Gene Hackman as a disillusioned football star who has become a detective. Night Moves. On BBC1 now, Everyman, presented by Peter France.
I've come here to this street near Oxford Circus in London in search of a 300-year-old antique.